Welcome to Morbid Matters. Be sure to follow me on here as well as my other social media platforms. And that being said, let's get into this case. So let me get into some cruel irony here for a moment. There are these two cases that are related, the Judith Barcy case and the Jeffrey MacDonald case. Judith Barcy was a child actress in the 80s and 90s. She voiced the role of Ducky in The Land Before Time. Well, Judith and her mother ended up being murdered by Judith's father in a fit of rage one evening. And that's a whole other case that I don't have time to fully delve into on this episode, but it will be in a follow-up episode because, again, these cases are kind of related in a sick way. Judith's first role was where she played Kimberly MacDonald in a TV miniseries called Fatal Vision. This miniseries was based off of true events. It followed the story of an army doctor named Jeffrey MacDonald. He was supposedly guilty of murdering his pregnant wife and children while stationed at Fort Bragg in 1970. Now, I will do the full story with Judith in another video, but in this video, we're going to focus on the MacDonald case. Now, this is a true crime case dealing with a family annihilator situation. This is often when one member of the family, typically the father, out of nowhere seems to snap and murder his whole family. We saw a similar situation with the Chris Watts case in recent years, which has been pretty heavily covered in the true crime community. But basically, Chris was having an affair, as well as some financial issues here and there, and he ended up murdering his pregnant wife and two young daughters. And this case is pretty much the same thing. A seemingly perfect family. The husband did have some extramarital affairs, and the wife and two young daughters come up brutally murdered. I'm going to try to leave any of my opinions out of this one, at least while I'm telling the story, because I have changed my mind on this case so many times. I really do not know what to think anymore. Like, normally we have a really, clear-cut guilty verdict, and I mean, this one, according to the courts, was also pretty clear-cut and guilty, but I'm not sure. Like, I'm not saying that this person is innocent, I'm not saying that they're guilty, I'm genuinely just not sure of what happened here. But this is one of the most horribly interesting cases that I've ever come across. It does involve the brutal and very graphic, detailed murders of a pregnant woman and her two young children, so please be aware of that before we get started. Jeffrey MacDonald was born on October 12th, 1943 in New York. He had a pretty strict father growing up, and his family was somewhat poor, but this didn't hold him back, at least not in high school. He was voted class president, he got voted most likely to succeed, and most popular. So he was definitely one of those popular kids who won every award. At least in my school, they seemed to corner the market on everything, but they also were the ones who ended up counting the votes. So it's kind of hard, like, at least, for me, it was kind of hard to get a good read on who actually won what. Jeffrey had a crush on Collette Stevenson's since the 8th grade, and they briefly dated, I guess you'd say dated, in 9th grade, but it ended that summer and they ended up going their separate ways for a while. Jeffrey ended up with a scholarship to Princeton to study medicine as he wanted to be a doctor. He and Collette ended up rekindling their relationship while she was a freshman at Skidmore College. Jeffrey later said that since their high school relationship, Collette seemed to have grown kind of shy with a slight fear of the world in general, and she seemed to heavily rely on Jeffrey's self-confidence. And Jeffrey really liked this. He liked to feel like he was not only her boyfriend, but also her protector. Apparently, Jeffrey was casually dating other women at the time that he dated Collette in college, but in 1963, Collette told him that she was pregnant, and he vowed then to marry her. Collette kind of ended up dropping out of school for a while to raise their child, and in 1963 they got married. It was a pretty big ceremony in New York. Collette's parents gave the couple their blessing, so all was well with that, and the couple would honeymoon in Cape Cod. They named their first daughter Kimberly, who again would be played by Judith Barsi in the miniseries. She was born on April 18th, 1964. Jeffrey would go on to complete his undergrad at Princeton, and he got accepted into Northwestern Medical School. So he, Collette, and baby Kimberly moved to Chicago in the summer of 1965. They were living in a small one-bedroom apartment at this time. Colette's job was to take care of Kimberly and maintain the household, so she was like, you know, your typical trad wife, while Jeffrey focused on his schoolwork and worked a series of part-time jobs to help the family get by. He was very focused on his career of becoming a doctor. The next year, the couple would move into a more middle-class neighborhood, and their second daughter, Kristin Jean, was born in May of 1967. Jeffrey would go on to graduate medical school. He got a one-year internship at the Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center in New York, where he was to specialize in thoracic surgery. So the family moved once again to Bergenfield, New Jersey, which was only about 15 minutes from the hospital. I actually MapQuested that because I was interested in the commute. Jeffrey said that the year of his internship was the most horrendous year for him and Collette as a couple. He was working 36 hours straight with only like 12 hours at home. And when he would be at home, he was so exhausted that he didn't really get to spend any time with his family. But after this year-long internship was over, he and Collette ended up vacationing in Aruba before Jeffrey ended up joining the Army. So in June of 1968, Jeffrey would enlist in the U.S. Army. He does 6 weeks of basic training at Fort Sam Houston in Texas. While in basic, he volunteered to be assigned to the Army's Special Forces, also known as the Green Berets, to become a Special Forces physician. Then he gets assigned to Fort Benning, Georgia, where he completed their paratrooper training course. Now, this was of course during the time of the Vietnam War, and it was a possibility that he could be sent overseas. But he later learned that as a Green Beret doctor, it was less likely for him to be sent overseas. By August of 1969, Jeffrey was in the 3rd Airborne Special Forces Group at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, set to serve as the group's surgeon. Collette and the children soon joined him, and they moved to a section of the base reserved for married officers. The couple quickly became popular among their neighbors, although Jeffrey and Collette were known to have argued occasionally. Which, like, what couple doesn't, though, you know? By the time the family got to Fort Bragg, Collette had managed to get 2 more years of college done. She was working on getting her bachelor's in English literature and teaching part-time. As for the girls, they had developed very different personalities, with Kimberly being more feminine, quiet, and shy, and Kristin being a boisterous tomboy. In December of 1969, so only like 3 months after Jeffrey had joined, the 3rd Special Forces Group was deactivated. So he was transferred on base to the 6th Special Forces Group. And I'm just going to tell you guys, Army terminology is kind of confusing to me. So I'm trying not to focus too much on that. But he was there to serve as their preventative medical officer. So basically, he was like, you know, the guy doing routine checkups and stuff like that. By Christmas of 1969, Collette was about 3 months pregnant with their 3rd child, and this time it was going to be a boy. Jeffrey ends up buying his daughters a pony. He was anticipating that they were about to be relocated to a farm in Connecticut, so they would be able to bring this pony with them. He was able to keep it a secret at first until driving the girls to a stable on Christmas Day to meet the pony. The girls ended up naming the pony Trooper. So this actually reminds me a little bit of when I was 3 years old and I had finished opening all of my presents on Christmas morning, and my grandfather brings me this big red box with holes cut in the top. And he said, "Wait, you have one more present." And I opened it, and inside it was this little Cocker Spaniel puppy, and I named her Moon, and that is why I still love Cocker Spaniels so much to this day. And that's why now I have this little guy. Not the same dog, obviously. It's been a very long time. Moon sadly passed away. But this is Zeppelin, and he is my second cocker. He might just sit here for the rest of the video. Okay, so moving on with the story. Right around Christmas, Collette wrote to some of her college friends describing her life as never being so normal or happy, saying that she and Jeffrey were so content and their baby was going to be due in July, and then her family would be complete. By 1970, Jeffrey was able to make the rank of captain, and he was planning on studying more advanced medical training at Yale University after completing his tour of duty as a Green Beret doctor. On February 16, 1970, Jeffrey took his daughters to ride the pony that he had bought for them on Christmas. They got back home around 5:45 p.m. Jeffrey took a shower, the family ate dinner, and Collette left to go to an evening teaching class. According to Jeffrey, he played horsey with his daughters where he pretended to be a pony and they would ride on his back. I'm sure a lot of you have probably done that with your dad at some point. He ended up putting Kristin to bed around 7 p.m. while Kimberly played at the coffee table. They watched Kimberly's favorite TV show before she also went to bed. Collette got back home around 9:40 p.m. and she and Jeffrey sat on the couch together watching TV before Collette decided to go to bed, and Jeffrey ended up falling asleep in the living room in the early hours of the morning on February 17th. At 3:42 a.m. on February 17th, 1970, an emergency call was received by dispatchers at Fort Bragg by Jeffrey MacDonald. Jeffrey could be heard screaming, "Help! 544 Castle Drive! Stabbing!" before the 911 operator heard the phone clatter against a wall or the floor. Within 10 minutes of the phone call, military police arrived on scene. They first thought they were responding to a domestic disturbance. The front door was closed and locked, and the house was dark inside. When no one answered the door, they went to the back of the house, where a police sergeant found the back screen door closed and unlocked, with the back door itself wide open. The sergeant entered the house and walked into the master bedroom, before immediately turning and running, shouting, "Tell them to get Womack, ASAP." Womack is the Army hospital at Fort Bragg. Jeffrey's wife, Collette, was found sprawled on the floor of the master bedroom on her back. She had one eye open and one of her breasts were exposed, with the other covered by a blood-stained pajama top. Now, this will be significant later. She had been clubbed all over her body to the extent that both of her forearms were broken, and this was likely done as she was attempting to protect her face from the blows. Collette had been stabbed 21 times in the chest with an ice pick, an additional 16 times around the neck and chest with a knife. This was so severe, actually, that her trachea was severed in 2 places. A paring knife was also found next to her body. Jeffrey was found face down laying next to Collette. He was wounded himself, but he was still alive, and he had one arm around Colette's chest and another around her neck. When military police arrived in the room, he whispered to them to go check his kids because he thought he heard them crying. 5-year-old Kimberly was found still in her bed down the hall. She had also been bludgeoned on her head and body, and she had been stabbed in the neck with a knife about 10 times. The wounds to her head were so severe they actually caused her cheekbones to come through the skin, and the blows to her head were done with such a force that they would have immediately caused bruising on the brain, coma, and then death. That's how hard this little girl was hit with something. Across the hall, 2-year-old Kristin was also found in her own bed, lying on her side with a baby bottle still near her mouth. She had been stabbed 33 times across her neck, chest, hands, and back with a knife, and stabbed an additional 15 times with an ice pick. 2 knife wounds had penetrated her heart, and the ice pick wounds were noted to be shallow. The injuries to her hands were likely defensive wounds, meaning she had likely woken up during the attack and tried to cover her little face. On the headboard of Jeffrey and Collette's bed was the word pig, written in Collette's blood. After Jeffrey was resuscitated, he sat upright and started yelling that he was going to kill those damn acid heads that had hurt his wife. Back then, hallucinogenic substances tended to be demonized by the public, and this had a lot to do with the Manson family murders, which are a bit related to this case because of the potential suspects. It was common for people to think that hallucinogens caused people to act crazy and violent, although that is rarely the case with just hallucinogens themselves. Jeffrey was taken to the hospital shouting at emergency workers to let him see his kids while he was taken out on a stretcher. While he was at the hospital, doctors realized that the wounds Jeffrey had suffered were much less severe than what his wife and children had endured. He had some cuts, bruises, fingernail scratches to his head and chest, but none of these wounds were life-threatening or required stitches. He did have a mild concussion and a single stab wound between 2 ribs on his right torso. This wound was described by a surgeon as a clean, small, sharp incision that caused his lung to collapse. Jeffrey was released from the hospital after 9 days. So obviously, with a crime like this, Jeffrey was getting questioned by the Criminal Investigation Division of the United States Army. So Jeffrey's version of events were that at around 2 a.m. on February 17th, he had washed up the dishes from dinner the night before and decided to go to bed. But his daughter Kristin had been sleeping in their bed, and she ended up wetting his side of the bed. So he ended up taking Kristin back to her own bed. He didn't want to wake up Collette by changing the sheets, so he grabbed a blanket from Kristin's room and fell asleep on the couch. Then he claims that he was awakened to Collette and Kimberly's screams. He gets up from the couch to go help his family and was attacked by 3 male intruders. One of these intruders was black, the other 2 were white. The shorter of the 2 white men had worn what appeared to be surgical gloves, and there was a 4th intruder, described as a white female with long blonde hair that was possibly a wig. She was wearing high-heeled, knee-high boots and a white floppy hat that partially covered her face. Jeffrey said that this female intruder had just stood nearby holding a lit candle, chanting, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs." Jeffrey claimed that the 3 males attacked him with a club and an ice pick, while the female intruder yelled, "Hit him again." During this struggle, Jeffrey's pajama top was pulled up over his head to his wrists, and I guess it made like a rope, you know, when you wad up your clothing, like it becomes this kind of solid object, like, hold on, I'm gonna get something to describe. So he was working with something kind of like this, you know, and he used this bound garment to ward off the blows from the ice pick, but eventually the assailants were able to still overpower him and he was knocked out in the living room. He said that by the time he regained consciousness, the intruders had left the house. So Jeffrey stumbles into the girls' rooms, attempting CPR on his slain daughters, but to no avail. Then he gets to his wife. He pulled a small paring knife from Collette's chest and tossed it onto the floor, attempting to find her pulse, but she was long gone by this point. He then draped his pajama top over her body and phoned for help. Now, this was all Jeffrey's version of events, and besides the weird acid people story, the part that I find most sus is that he, being a fucking surgeon, tried to pull the knife out of Collette's chest. You never ever do that, by the way. Do not pull out. I mean, sometimes, but, you know, in this occasion, you don't want to do that. Anyways, Yeah, you just don't want to risk that. I know they do it in movies a lot, but you never want to try and pull out something that could be inside of a vital organ or arteries, because that's how you end up bleeding out. So with the initial investigation, the military police were checking all vehicles around Fort Bragg for the perpetrators matching Jeffrey's description of the crazed acid people, as we'll call them. The one black guy, two white guys, and the blonde woman in a floppy hat. But the police couldn't find anyone matching these descriptions, and they abandoned the search by 6 a.m. that next morning. Right after daybreak on February 17th, the investigators found the murder weapons right outside the back door of the MacDonald home. They were a kitchen knife, a 31-inch long piece of lumber covered in blood, and an ice pick. All three came from the home, and they had all been wiped clean of fingerprints. Jeffrey later claimed that he had never seen any of these items before. Investigators quickly began to think that Jeffrey was lying about what happened. They didn't find much evidence to support his version of the events. The living room, where he had supposedly fought for his life against 3 armed men, showed few signs of a struggle aside from the coffee table being knocked on its side and a flower pot that had fallen on the floor. The MacDonald's neighbors had said that they didn't hear sounds of a struggle or a disturbance, but they had heard Collette shouting in a loud, angry voice. The 16-year-old daughter of these neighbors, who often babysat for the MacDonalds, said the couple had seemed indifferent to each other over the last month or so. By February 23rd, the marshal at Fort Bragg advised the FBI to discontinue their search for the 4 intruders because they thought it was a bullshit waste of time, essentially. Besides the little evidence of damage in the house, no fibers from Jeffrey's torn pajama bottoms were found in the living room. He claimed they had been torn in the struggle. However, fibers from the pajama top were found beneath Collette's body and in the bedroom of both daughters. One fiber from this garment was also found under Kristin's fingernail. Bloodstained splinters, which likely came from that piece of lumber, were found in all 3 bedrooms, but not in the living room where Jeffrey claimed he was attacked. No blood or fingerprints were found on either of the 2 phones in the home, which Jeffrey claims he used to call for help after checking each member of his family and attempting CPR on them. The blood-stained tip of a surgical glove was also found beneath the headboard where the word pig had been written in blood. The glove was identical in composition to the medical supply Jeffrey kept in the family kitchen. Even though it hadn't rained that night, Jeffrey claimed that the female intruder's boots were all wet with rainwater just dripping off of them, but the only footprint even at the scene that night was a bloody bare footprint leading away from Kristin's bed. By March, the forensics testing had came back, and although they didn't have DNA testing at the time, they could still get a lot of information with hair, blood, and fiber samples. And these all contradicted Jeffrey's version of events. Like, his own blood was only found in front of the kitchen cabinet that contained the rubber gloves and on the right side of the hallway bathroom sink. Collette's blood was also found in Kristin's room, even though the 3 victims had been found in different rooms, which made it seem like they had been attacked separately. Kimberly's blood had also been found in the master bedroom, making it seem like she had been attacked upon entering the room. But why would intruders attack her and carry her back to her bedroom to continue the attack? It did help investigators that everyone in this family happened to have a different blood type, which is a statistical anomaly, but it helped the investigation reconstruct the scene of events that night. So here is what investigators think happened based on the forensic evidence. Jeffrey and Collette had a fight in the master bedroom, possibly over Kristin always sleeping in there and wetting the bed, or perhaps it was the fact that Jeffrey had been cheating on his wife and she found out, which is something that the investigation found out about Jeffrey pretty quickly. Yeah, he got around. Investigators think that the argument turned physical, and maybe Collette hit Jeffrey in the forehead with a hairbrush, which is why he had a mark on his forehead that didn't actually break the skin. They thought he retaliated by hitting her first with his fist and then beating her with a piece of lumber. Kimberly likely walked in after hearing the commotion and was struck at least once in the head, maybe by accident. Thinking Collette was dead, Jeffrey carried the mortally wounded Kimberly back to her room. So they think that what happened is, Kimberly hears all of this commotion going on, and she runs into the master bedroom where Jeffrey is already in there beating Collette with this big piece of lumber, and as he, rears back, Kimberly gets struck in the head, and because this is so forceful, she, immediately has brain bruising and falls into a coma. And then Jeffrey would have carried Kimberly back to her own bedroom where he continued attacking her. After stabbing Kimberly repeatedly, he then went to Kristin's room carrying the piece of lumber he had used to bludgeon Kimberly and Collette, to dispose of the last remaining witness, even though she was only 2 years old. But before he could do this, Collette regained consciousness, since her blood was found on Kristin's bed covers and on a wall of her room. They think that she threw her body over Kristin's in a desperate attempt to protect her, but Jeffrey would end up killing them both and wrapped Collette's body in a bed sheet, carried her back to the master bedroom, which left the smudged footprint as he left Kristin's bedroom, and this bloody footprint actually turned out to be Collette's blood. Jeffrey then laid his torn pajama top over Collette's dead body and repeatedly stabbed her with an ice pick. Then he discarded all of the murder weapons next to the back door after wiping them clean of his fingerprints. Finally, he takes a scalpel blade from the supply closet, entered the hall bathroom, stabs himself once in the chest while standing beside the sink before disposing of the surgical gloves. Then he calls 911 before laying down next to Collette's body and waited for military police to arrive. On April 6th of 1970, Army investigators formally cautioned, then interrogated Jeffrey MacDonald. He was first offered to change his version of events, but he wouldn't change much about his story, and honestly, he never really did change much about his story. He was sticking to the 4 crazy intruders claim. He denied ever even seeing the murder weapons. He denied stabbing himself. He claimed he was unaware of how the blood patterns contradicted his movements and account of events. He had no explanation for why the house wasn't in more of a disarray from such a struggle, or how Kimberly's blood and brain serum got in the master bedroom. He then accused the interrogator of running out of ideas and attempting to frame him so he could keep his 100% solved homicide rate. He initially agreed to take a polygraph test, but then declined 10 minutes later, so he was just kind of all over the place. Although he did at some point take a polygraph test, although those results were sealed later in court. Jeffrey was relieved of his duties with the Army on April 6th and was given an Army lawyer, but he decided to hire his own lawyer, the civil defense attorney Bernard Segal. He even wrote a letter to Collette's parents saying that the Army would never admit their error and that he believed his wife's soul may hold infinite patience and understanding of his current legal predicament. So an official Army hearing of these charges began in July of 1970 and lasted through September. Bernard Segal, Jeffrey's lawyer, said that the military investigators had trampled all over the crime scene. They had lost pieces of evidence that could have been from the real perpetrators, like a fiber that had been found underneath Kimberly's fingernails and a piece of skin that was found under Collette's nails. There were so many pieces of evidence that were either just unable to be tested or ended up lost. Segal listed off several other instances of incompetence from military police and emergency personnel, like an ambulance driver who stole Jeffrey's wallet from the living room at the crime scene, which that's just super sketchy in any situation for an ambulance driver to be robbing people while he's responding to an emergency. The first witness to testify on Jeffrey's behalf at this Army hearing was one of the responding military police officers. He said that when he was on the way to the MacDonald home after responding to the 911 call, he had seen a blonde woman with a wide-brimmed hat standing on a street corner about half a mile from the MacDonald's home. And he thought this was strange given how late it was and the weather being particularly cold that night. This officer also said that an ambulance driver had placed the tilted flower pot that was found in the living room upright while he was at the crime scene, despite being told not to mess with anything. The colonel who oversaw this hearing said that he himself had gone to the crime scene and tipped over the coffee table where it struck the side of a rocking chair and came to a rest on its edge. He also said there were no wet footprints or mud found from the alleged intruders, and the investigators hadn't found any evidence of the large number of military, police, and emergency personnel who had been in the home. Somehow there were no fingerprints or hair fibers or footprints or anything like that from the military and responding officers and emergency personnel and all the other people who had been in that house. A police officer offered a possible identity to the blonde intruder. He said it might have been a 17-year-old local addict and police informant that he worked with named Helena Stoeckly. A delivery driver named William Posey had even more information about Helena. He claimed that he saw her outside of her apartment with 2 or 3 males at around 4 a.m. on the day of the murders. He also said that she had stopped wearing her boots and floppy hat after the murders. She was seen wearing black on the day of the family's funerals, despite supposedly not knowing them or even going to the funerals. Posey also said that Helena had told him that she didn't remember what she did the day of the murders and that she and her boyfriend couldn't get married until they killed more people. When questioned by police about her whereabouts the day of the murders, Helena gave vague answers that contradicted each other. She said she was with her boyfriend Gregory Mitchell the night of February 16th. She said they had been riding around aimlessly into the early hours of the 17th, but she claims that she had been so intoxicated from hallucinogens that she didn't know for sure if she had gone home or not. Witnesses even claimed that Helena had admitted to the murders, and several people recalled her wearing the clothing like Jeffrey described, but she was never made to testify at this Army hearing. Jeffrey's lawyer noted these procedural irregularities regarding investigative conduct at the hearing, and I have to agree, this case does seem to be very botched. Now, Jeffrey had been a pretty well-liked guy by all accounts. He had several people testify that he was a good guy and didn't seem to be capable of something like this. He ended up testifying for himself, but some of his testimony contradicted what he had told police originally. Like, this time he said that he actually did have to move Collette's body after finding her a little bit propped up against a chair before he sort of laid her flat on the floor. He admitted that because of his surgical background, he may have rinsed off his hands in the bathroom before calling for help, and since his blood was also found in the kitchen sink, he said he may have rinsed his hands off there as well for some reason before calling police. Doctor or not, if your family has just been murdered, how are you running around the house to wash your hands before calling 911? He also claimed, and this was contrary to any of the medical reports done on him in the hospital, that he had 2 bumps on the back of his head, 2 to 3 puncture wounds on the left side of his chest, wounds on his right bicep, and about 10 ice pick wounds to his abdomen. So he claimed that despite being in the hospital for 9 days with all of his injuries listed, that he had way more injuries that doctors didn't write down or notice, but they all ended up going away without medical intervention. Jeffrey was also questioned about him cheating on Collette. He admitted to sleeping around twice, but said that Collette had not found out about the affairs and that their time at Fort Bragg had actually been the happiest of their married life. The psychiatrist that examined Jeffrey noticed that he had an extraordinary lack of anger, anxiety, and depression regarding the loss of his family. The report stated that he was able to muster massive denial or repression to such a degree that the impact of recent events in his life had somewhat been blunted. This extreme psychological response likely would see an individual convey himself as victimized or somewhat of a martyr. So he had completely masked his emotions, or he really just didn't feel anything other than himself somehow being the victim of this whole situation. At least this is what some of the psychiatrists have said. You'll see in this case that no psychiatrist actually diagnoses him as crazy or with any sort of mental affliction, but it does seem like a lot of them either think that, you know, he gets over things way too easily, which that could be partially due to his military background, and that he does seem to be more full of himself and sort of conceited. In October of 1970, a report was issued recommending the charges against Jeffrey be dropped because of insufficient evidence to prove his guilt, and that the nature of the murders seemed more like some crazed lunatics who were out of their mind on substances actually did it. I have to sort of agree with this here because of the amount of brutal injuries that the family sustained. It does seem more like a frenzied overkill attack, and the amount of rage and energy that it would have taken, it's just almost hard to believe that one person would have been capable of this. This report also recommended further investigation into Helena, the blonde chick, and all charges were formally dismissed on Jeffrey. Although a new investigation was open and tasked with finding the murderers in February of 1971, and Jeffrey was still considered a suspect, in December of 1970, Jeffrey received an honorable discharge from the Army, which, I mean, if he still got an honorable discharge for possibly murdering his entire family, I'd hate to see what qualifies as a dishonorable discharge. Apparently, it's espionage, dissertation, or going AWOL, treason, essay, or murder. So Jeffrey goes back to New York for a bit, working as a doctor. Then he moves to Long Beach, California in July of 1971. He was trying to put the past behind him, I guess, so he starts working in the ER at St. Mary's Medical Center, where he would work really long hours. He also became an instructor at the UCLA School of Medicine, a medical director for the Long Beach Grand Prix, which was like a Formula One car racing thing, I guess. He ironically became a lecturer on the subject of identifying and treating child abuse, which I just feel like is strange given his past. Whether he did it or not, it just seems odd. He also participated in developing a national CPR training program, so he was a super busy and seemingly very successful guy despite everything that had happened. He was living in a $350,000 condo in Huntington Beach, which today is like $13 million. And he initially, I don't know how much it is, but in California it probably is. And he initially was rather promiscuous after getting to California before settling down into a long-term relationship with a 22-year-old flight attendant named Candy Kramer in the late 1970s. Right after the charges were dismissed, Jeffrey started doing press interviews. On one talk show he did in December of 1970, he complained about the Army investigation focusing on him as a suspect, and he claimed to have sustained 23 wounds, some of which he claimed were potentially fatal. His stories about his injuries were just getting like worse and worse and more elaborate, I guess. Well, Collette's mother and stepfather, who for the sake of the story, I'm just going to call him her dad because he seems to be the main father figure in her life, and, you know, the amount of stuff that he does for his stepdaughter, it's really what, like, a father would do. Well, Colette's mother and stepfather first felt like Jeffrey was innocent. But when the stepfather, Alfred Kassab, asked Jeffrey about getting the transcript of the Article 32 Army hearing that ended up being 2,000 pages long, Jeffrey was reluctant to give it to him, and Jeffrey even told Collette's stepdad that he and some of the army guys tracked down, tortured, and murdered one of the alleged intruders. So Collette's dad gets even more suspicious after he saw Jeff on a talk show acting very casual and dismissive. And this talk show appearance was only 5 days after Jeffrey had hand-delivered 500 copies of an 11-page letter to members of Congress requesting a congressionally mandated reinvestigation of the murders. This is when Collette's parents, Alfred and Mildred, decided to publicly turn against Jeffrey. So Alfred did manage to get a copy of this Army investigation transcript by February of 1971. He went over everything, and he realized how inconsistent Jeffrey's story had been and how the physical evidence wasn't adding up. Like, Jeffrey kept telling people that he had these life-threatening injuries, which weren't in any of the medical reports. And within just a few weeks of the murders, Jeffrey was already dating a young woman that he had met at Fort Bragg. Regardless here, this is very suspicious to me. If my husband were murdered, or if I were murdered, I'm sure, I can't imagine him getting into a relationship weeks later. Alfred was allowed to visit the crime scene, where he compared physical evidence against Jeffrey's testimony, and this is what really convinced Collette's parents that Jeffrey was guilty. And Alfred decided to devote his life to bring Jeffrey to justice. But since the Army had completed its investigation, the only way Alfred had a chance to bring Jeffrey to trial was through a citizen's complaint filed through the United States Department of Justice. So Alfred files this complaint in 1972, but since the murders happened while Jeffrey was in the Army and he had since been discharged, the citizen's complaint was not effective and the FBI refused to take the case. I do think that it's really convenient that Jeffrey's life seemed to get a lot better after these murders. He was able to publicly get attention and sympathy and seem like this victim who lost his family. He got an honorable discharge from the Army, so now he can go wherever he wants, and best of all for him is that he gets to live this bachelor lifestyle and sleep around while living on the beach in California. Things he probably felt like he couldn't do with a wife and kids. So for a couple of years, this case was just kind of in limbo while the U.S. Department of Justice sorted out the legal issues and debated over whether there was sufficient evidence to even retry this case. The attorney for Collette's parents and an Army investigations agent presented a citizen's complaint against Jeffrey MacDonald to the U.S. Chief District Court, where they requested a grand jury to indict Jeffrey for the murders. The following month, an attorney for the U.S. Department of Justice ruled the case worthy of prosecution. In August of 1974, a grand jury convenes on this case in Raleigh, North Carolina. There were a total of 75 witnesses called in to testify, and Jeffrey would be the first to testify on his own behalf. His testimony lasted for 5 days, and he would tell the court that he had tried to identify the perpetrators and locate Helena Stoeckly, the blonde 17-year-old suspect mentioned previously. He claimed all of the fabrications he had made to his in-laws and the media after the murders were just to try and make his in-laws feel better and placate them, if you will. And he swore he received way more injuries and stab wounds than what was on record, and he blamed that on malpractice. When he was asked to do a polygraph test, Jeffrey just read a statement from his lawyers denying the request. Other witnesses included doctors from the Army hospital who treated Jeffrey, and they claimed aside from the small puncture that collapsed his lung, he wasn't in any grave danger medically. Another witness was a reporter who had covered the first Army hearing, and he stated that it was very rare for people on LSD to become violent. Which is what I've been saying as well. I feel like for a doctor, Jeffrey didn't seem to know very much about what substances actually did to people. A psychiatrist who examined Jeffrey after the murder said he would become emotional and tearful, but he recovered quickly from his grief. This psychiatrist also said he found Jeffrey to be a controlling person who was very dependent on what others thought of him. He said Jeffrey didn't have a mental disorder, but he could not discount the possibility of him snapping and murdering his family in a situation of extreme stress. Although I suppose anyone is technically capable of that. I mean, you don't necessarily have to have a mental disorder or an anger problem to potentially snap and kill someone. A second psychologist who examined Jeffrey stated that if he had committed such an act of violence, he would have been able to successfully block the episode from his mind. And this is very telling because he did immediately start seeing other women and trying to move on with his life and putting himself into all this different work. A chief forensic chemist from the FBI testified that the pajama top that was placed over Collette's body, the one that Jeffrey claimed he had used to block the blows from the intruders, this kind of thing. He said that this piece of clothing had been heavily blood-stained prior to it being torn. This was contrary to what Jeffrey had claimed. There were 48 holes in this pajama top from someone stabbing it, like it had been folded over and someone stabbed it 24 times. It created the 48 total holes. But the lack of tearing around the edges of these holes proved that the garment was not moving, rather than being flung around, during an attack. Meaning he possibly put it over Collette's already dead body and started stabbing through the pajama top, which is what was theorized in the original investigation. The FBI forensics guy also said that all of the cuts on the other articles of clothing on Collette's body had been cut with the kitchen knife, not the paring knife that Jeffrey had pulled out of Collette's body. The majority of the blood belonged to Collette. Her blood had transferred to the garment in several places before it was torn. The piece of lumber used as a club to bludgeon Collette and Kimberly, which Jeffrey said he had never seen. In January of 1975, Jeffrey was called to testify again in front of another grand jury. The previous jury, there were no convictions yet. They were just essentially reopening the case and getting started with witnesses, I guess. Well, on January 24th, 1975, Jeffrey was formally indicted on 3 counts of murder, and indictment is like the beginning of legal proceedings against someone. Within the hour, he was arrested in California. But within a week, he was free on $100,000 bail raised by friends and colleagues. I can confidently say that I don't have any friends who would raise $100,000 in bail money for me in less than a week if I had possibly murdered my whole family. I don't have any friends like this yet, at least. So if anyone's interested, I promise I'm pretty low flight risk. Jeffrey would be arraigned on May 23rd, and he pled not guilty. The double jeopardy argument was denied, and the trial date was set for August 18th. However, the whole indictment ended up getting dismissed in January of 1976 because of the defendant's right to a speedy trial argument. Basically, the court took too long, so they ended up throwing out the whole thing, and Jeffrey said that he wept tears of relief upon hearing the news that he was free. Yeah, this case is wild. There's so much back and forth. It's ridiculous. It wasn't until May of 1978. Yeah, you think that this case is over. It's not over, trust me. The court proceedings with this thing have been fucking insane, and I'm sorry it's taking so long for us to finally get to the result, but this is all very important. So, May 1978, an appeal on behalf of the Supreme Court led to reinstating the indictment. Yeah, this case went all the way to the top yet again, and they voted 8-0 to reinstate this case. Collette's stepfather told the press, "It has been a tremendous personal pressure to have someone running around that you are convinced killed your daughter and grandchildren." Which I really feel for Collette's parents, because I don't have children of my own, so I can't really imagine this nightmare. I can't blame them here. I know that they felt like their life's mission after this was to get justice for their family. So we finally get to the formal trial in July of 1979. It's been over 9 years since the murders at this point, so I think it's safe to say the court system has been a total failure in this case. So Jeffrey is being charged with 3 counts of murder, and it's back to Raleigh, North Carolina. He's still being defended by his attorney, Bernard Segal, who was confident of an acquittal. But there were successful rulings against the defense. The first ruling was that the judge refused to admit into evidence a 1979 psychiatric evaluation on Jeffrey that suggested someone like himself would be highly unlikely of killing his family. The judge didn't want to focus on the mental state since they weren't using an insanity plea. The judge also allowed the pajama top evidence and the March 1970 copy of Esquire magazine found in the MacDonald home, which contained a lengthy article about the Manson family murders. There's a lot of similarities on how he describes the supposed intruders and the hippies in the Manson family who went on this killing spree in Los Angeles, murdering pregnant actress Sharon Tate, coffee heiress Abigail Folger, and several others in the summer of 1969, which would have been only like 6 months before this case happened. So the opening statements in the case against Jeffrey MacDonald were delivered to the jury on July 19th, 1979. The prosecution was going to prove that Jeffrey had premeditated these murders through physical and circumstantial evidence. The defense argued that the Army investigation had dismissed all charges and that Jeffrey had tried to rebuild his life over the last 9 years, while others just wouldn't let it go. The prosecution reintroduced the pajama top evidence, and like I said before, they demonstrated it had to have been placed over Collette's body and repeatedly stabbed with an ice pick. The holes in the pajama top had not been torn, they were still rather smooth and cylindrical, which is very unlikely. If Jeffrey had used it in a struggle with intruders, it would have been, going around like this instead of, but if you're sitting it flat and you stab something, the holes are going to look, clean. If you're moving it around, they're going to tear and get jagged. That was the whole point. Another damning piece of evidence against Jeffrey was an audio tape made on April 6th, 1970. This was part of the initial interviews by the military investigators. They played this tape in the courtroom for the jurors, and in this tape, Jeffrey was giving his account of the murders, but he came off very indifferent. But when he was questioned about his potential involvement, he could be heard getting angry and defensive. In this tape, investigators also asked about his extramarital affairs, and Jeffrey kind of joked like, "Oh, you guys are more thorough than I thought," and his behavior on the tape just didn't look good to the jury. Jeffrey's lawyers did have some favorable character witnesses though, and they pulled in a forensic expert that tried to refute the FBI forensic guy's testimony about the tears in the pajama top. He said that he had stabbed a pajama top wrapped around a ham while his assistant moved it back and forth. I'm just imagining someone stabbing a ham wrapped in a pajama top. And he claims he got these smooth cylindrical holes like the pajama top found on Collette, so maybe it could still make these smooth holes while in motion. That was the whole point of this other guy coming in, I guess, is to refute the original evidence on this damn pajama top. But the prosecution totally upstaged this guy. They did a reenactment of the alleged attack on Jeffrey. One prosecutor wrapped a pajama top made of the same material as the one at the crime scene around his hands and attempted to fend off a series of blows from the second prosecutor. So it's like, like this. And they even used the same ice pick as in the murders to conduct these blows, which is just kind of mind-blowing. Yeah, they like really did all of this in a courtroom. It's pretty wild to think about. But the resulting ice pick holes in the pajama top were elongated and jagged, not smooth and cylindrical like on the pajama top at the crime scene. And the prosecutor receiving the blows got a small wound on his right arm, whereas Jeffrey had no defensive wounds consistent with a struggle. The only blood from Jeffrey even found in the living room where he claimed this attack had taken place was one drop on the Esquire magazine and a small flake of blood on his glasses. You'd think if it was a frenzied attack against 4 other people, there would have been more blood from him than that, especially if his injuries were as bad as he later claimed. Now back to Helena Stoeckly, the young blonde woman who was originally thought to be one of the real intruders that ended up slipping away from the initial investigation. Jeffrey's lawyer was able to subpoena her to testify, and he thought he'd be able to get a confession from her in court that she was actually involved in these murders. Jeffrey's lawyer spoke to her in private for over 2 hours, trying to get her to just confess and end all of this suffering for Jeffrey, and he promised her immunity from prosecution due to the statute of limitations. But Helena repeatedly said she could not help him, and she denied ever seeing Jeffrey and refused to admit crimes that she was adamant she did not commit. At least at this point in time, she's adamant she didn't commit them. She changes this story many times. While under oath, Helena denied any action in the murders and denied knowing who may have committed the murders. She insisted she didn't remember what she was doing the day of the murders, which, yeah, like, if I didn't do anything significant, I can't recall where I was on this day 9 years ago either. I can barely remember what date or day of the week it is, so if I ever get accused of murder, I'm fucked on an alibi. Helena also emphasized that she was on a fuck ton of substances in the 70s and admitted that the nights of February 16th and 17th were by no means the first or last times she was unable to recall her whereabouts. Girl, same, that was me all throughout the mid-2000s. I was lucky to even know what state I was in on any given night. Moral of the story is don't abuse substances. There was an argument in court about allowing the alleged witnesses Helena had supposedly confessed to take the stand, but the judge denied this motion. So Helena had confessed to there were at least a dozen people at various points who said Helena had confessed these murders to them, or she said that she was at the MacDonald home on the night of these murders, but none of these people were allowed to testify at the court hearing. The reason for this is because Helena's story changed so many times. She was on so many drugs. I guess the courts didn't feel like she was a reliable witness to anything, so anything she told anyone could have easily been dismissed as a lie. The last witness was Jeffrey himself, and he testified on his own behalf. First, Jeffrey was questioned by his own lawyer, who tried to humanize him to the jury and ask him questions about his family. So Jeffrey described Collette, Kimberly, and Kristin and their unique personalities. He said that his family shared everything and that they were the best of friends. He claimed he never remarried because he couldn't forget his wife and children. Although, let's not forget, he had no issue sleeping with other women no less than 2 weeks after the murders. Jeffrey said that the reason he had relocated to California and worked 80-hour weeks was to distance himself from the reminder of the murders. Next, the prosecution goes in on Jeffrey, and they outlined every piece of physical and circumstantial evidence recovered at the crime scene that contradicted Jeffrey's own accounts of the supposed intruders attacking him and murdering his family, stating that all these things indicated his own guilt. Jeffrey didn't really have an answer for these discrepancies in his story compared to the evidence found at the crime scene. He went over everything from the blood patterns not adding up, to the pajama top, to the piece of lumber under Kimberly's bed being used to bludgeon her and Collette, and Jeffrey didn't really have many answers as to why his accounts didn't match the physical evidence. The closing arguments before the jury started by the prosecution about the contrast of injuries between Collette, Kristin, Kimberly, and Jeffrey. The prosecutors referenced there was only the one substantial wound Jeffrey sustained from the supposed intruders, and that was the one that, kind of punctured his lung. The prosecution also stated the only life or death struggle fought in the home proved to be between Collette and Jeffrey. The defense focused on the campaign of persecution Jeffrey had been subjected to, and that the legal system just wanted to frame him for the murder of his family, and that Jeffrey had been a loving husband and father, and that there were still 4 guilty intruders out there who did this to the MacDonald family. The defense also noted there was no motive for these murders. By all accounts, Jeffrey had been a loving husband and father, and he and Collette were the happiest they had ever been. There was no history of domestic violence either. But this does seem to be a common scenario with these family annihilator cases. Things seem to look pretty perfect on the outside, but the husbands just end up snapping and brutally murder their families. We saw a similar pattern to this in the Chris Watts case. Actually, this is shockingly similar to that case. So the judge gave the jury 3 options after closing arguments. They could find Jeffrey not guilty, they could find him guilty of first-degree murder, or guilty of second-degree murder in each case. After deliberating for 6.5 hours, the jury reached a verdict. Jeffrey was convicted of first-degree murder in the death of Kristin and 2 counts of second-degree murder in the cases of Collette and Kimberly. Jeffrey displayed no emotion as the verdicts were read. The judge gave him 3 consecutive life sentences. He was inevitably sent to the Federal Correctional Institution in Terminal Island, California, which, what a name for an island that houses lifelong prison inmates, by the way. Collette's parents were happy with the verdict. They thanked their lawyer for his tireless efforts and stated that they can now finally rest. Now, this case still isn't quite over. In 1980, a panel of the 4th Circuit Court of Appeals overturned the MacDonald conviction. He managed to get out on $100,000 bail again. He returned to work as the ER director at St. Mary's in Long Beach. He even got engaged in 1982 to his girlfriend, Randy D. Markwith. Now, after some more legal rigmarole that I'll try not to bore you guys with too much, the U.S. Supreme Court got involved again and ruled that his right to a speedy trial had not been violated. So he was rearrested and returned to the federal prison with the same sentence of 3 consecutive life sentences. This is so mind-blowing that he got let off so many times and then arrested again. I've never heard of someone getting let off of all charges, getting tried again, convicted, let go, and arrested again. So he did a ton of appeals while in jail in the 80s and 90s. None of them really worked. He did stay in jail. But something worth noting is that in 2006, the Army DNA lab found that 3 hairs found at the crime scene, 1 from the bed sheet, 1 found around Collette's body, and 1 under Kristin's fingernail did not match anyone from the MacDonald family, nor any known suspect, which included Helena Stoeckly. This evidence is what really is making me unsure of what happened, because how did that hair get under baby Kristin's fingernail? I think it's safe to say that the military really fucked up the crime scene to some extent. I mean, the government is just very inefficient and inept at pretty much everything they do. Like, I don't know if maybe investigators and emergency personnel polluted the crime scene somehow, but how would it have gotten underneath her fingernail? In 2021, they tried a compassionate release because at this point, Jeffrey is super old and in poor health, and that was still denied. In 1980, right after Jeffrey was first released for those 3 years before he got locked up again, his supporters hired a retired FBI special agent turned private investigator named Ted Gunderson to help overturn his conviction. Ted contacted Helena Stoeckly. She claimed that she and 5 members of what she described as a drug cult had developed a grudge against Jeffrey because he refused to treat opiate-addicted patients. She and the other members of this group plotted revenge against Jeffrey, intending to murder his family but leave him alive. According to Helena, she had called the MacDonald home late on February 16th to see if everyone was present in the home. So Helena and this group of what is now 5 people instead of the original 4. I don't know what to believe from this woman at this point, but now she's saying it's 5. Helena claims that she and this group dropped mescaline, which is a very powerful hallucinogen, before driving to the MacDonald home. Helena and the 4 others entered the house and confronted Jeffrey, intent on forcing him to sign a dexedrine prescription, which is a stimulant like speed. But the situation quickly got out of control when Jeffrey tried to fight off the attackers before getting knocked unconscious himself. Helena said she ran to the master bedroom to find pigs written in the headboard and 2 of her friends bludgeoning Collette on the bed as her child lay asleep next to her. Helena was adamant that she had worn a beige floppy hat that evening. She even took a polygraph test in April 1971, and this was like after the initial investigation, but it was also done by the military. And the military examiner stated that Helena was convinced in her mind that she knows the identity of the people who killed Collette, Kimberly, and Kristin MacDonald. And that she was further convinced in her mind that she was physically present when the family was killed. No abnormal psychological responses were noted in the polygraph tracings. However, because of Helena's confusion and admitted substance use during and after the night of the murders, no conclusions could really be made on whether she really knew who committed the homicides or if she was truly present that night. Helena ended up confessing twice to her own mother that she was there on the night of the murders. An affidavit was filed in 2006 on behalf of Helena's mother about these confessions and that she had been afraid of the prosecutor. An affidavit is a sworn written legal statement. Helena ended up confessing yet again on her deathbed in 1983 when she was just 30 years old, dying of cirrhosis of the liver. Her brother also heard this confession and believed she had no reason to lie. I mean, she knew she was dying at this point, so what's the point of it, you know? Jeffrey's lawyers filed another appeal in 2006 based on the new DNA testing where those unknown hairs were found at the crime scene, the witness testimonies of those Helena had confessed to, and the fact that one of the prosecutors named James Blackburn had been disbarred in 1993 for fraud and embezzlement, so his statements should have been seen as unreliable. There was a second affidavit in 2005 filed by retired U.S. Marshal Jim Beret. Beret was a marshal during the trial, and he was in the room with prosecution when they questioned Helena. Bret stated he overheard Helena admit to the now disbarred prosecutor James Blackburn that she had actually been present at the MacDonald home the night of the murders, and that Blackburn threatened her with prosecution if she testified for the defense, and admitted that she was there that night. So Helena was being told by Jeffrey's lawyer that if she admitted she was there, he could get her immunity, but the prosecution is telling her that if she admitted she was there, they'd prosecute her. But when she met with Jeffrey's lawyer prior to this meeting with the prosecution, she said she had no memory of that night. There's just so much back and forth with this woman's stories. I don't know what to believe. So another appeal was filed for Jeffrey in 2006 because of the affidavit from Bret's claims, but the judge denied it because Helena was such an unreliable witness and had contradicted herself so many times over the years. Jeffrey would go on to try more appeals based on the various witness affidavits and DNA testing of the crime scene with those mysterious hairs that were found, but with all the red tape, it took forever, and they kept getting denied well into the 2000s. In June of 1979, author Joe McGinnis was invited to speak with Jeffrey about his case. Joe was unsure of Jeffrey's guilt or innocence at first, but was given full access to speak with Jeffrey and his defense team before the trial. Much like I am now, I do not know where I stand with this case at all. It's honestly the first one where I don't know. McGinnis went on to write the book Fatal Vision about the murders, based on psychological reports that found that Jeffrey handled his conflictions by denying that they even existed, saying that he lacked any sense of guilt and was incapable of forming close relationships with females of any age, and that Jeffrey resented his commitments as a husband and father. McGinnis came up with this narcissistic sociopath profile, so Fatal Vision ended up being about how Jeffrey was guilty of killing his family in cold blood. Fatal Vision also alleged a possible motive for the murders, which was that Jeffrey had been taking a stimulant weight loss drug similar to speed in an effort to lose weight for the Green Beret unit. It was suggested in the book that Jeffrey had this out-of-control, psychotic rage episode because of the substance that he was taking, accompanied with the long hours he worked and lack of sleep, that it was enough for him to snap. Now, Jeffrey thought McGinnis was going to make him seem innocent in his book, and it would be about the miscarriage of justice he had experienced, but this was obviously not the case. McGinnis reached a conclusion on Jeffrey's guilt pretty early on, but continued to make Jeffrey believe he thought he was innocent, so he would continue cooperating with him for the story. Jeffrey sued McGinnis for fraud over this dispute, and the two settled out of court for $350,000. Jeffrey would only end up getting $50,000 of that money because Collette's parents countersued him over an inheritance clause. Judith Barcy would play Kimberly MacDonald in the TV miniseries Fatal Vision. Judith was a child actress who also ended up being murdered by her own father, so a very cruel twist of fate there. Collette, Kimberly, and Kristin were laid to rest in Long Island on February 23, 1970. The last name MacDonald that was originally on the headstone was later taken off, and Colette's maiden name of Stevenson was put in its place. Jeffrey is still serving his life sentence. He is currently held at the Cumberland Federal Correctional Institution in Maryland, and he has always maintained his innocence. In 2017, he stated that he refused to lie to the parole board in hopes of getting a break. He said that if it takes him telling them that he killed his family to go home, then he's never getting out of prison. He claims that other evidence was suppressed at the trials, like synthetic hairs that were found on a hairbrush, unidentified fingerprints, as well as some black woolen fibers found around Colette's mouth and shoulder. Jeffrey's supporters claim this evidence was deliberately suppressed by the government from Jeffrey's legal team. In August 2002, Jeffrey married a former children's drama school owner and operator named Catherine Courage. The two had met decades ago in Baltimore and became reacquainted in 2007 when Catherine wrote to Jeffrey in a letter offering to help him with his case. The friendship quickly became romantic. The two got married while Jeffrey was still at the federal prison in California before he was transferred to Maryland because he would be closer to his legal state of residence as well as his wife. In 2005, at the urging of his new wife and attorneys, Jeffrey did apply for a parole board hearing, but his request was immediately denied. Gregory Mitchell, who was Helena's boyfriend at the time of the murders and the person she claimed murdered Collette. He also ended up dying of cirrhosis of the liver, like Helena, in 1982 at only 31 years old. Mitchell had also been a heavy substance user and allegedly confessed his involvement in the murders to several people. Although Mitchell had passed a polygraph test and was cleared of any involvement in the initial investigation. I don't necessarily agree with polygraph testing because it's just not accurate enough for me to find much stock in, and that's the whole reason that it's not admissible in court. But why would people say that he and Helena had both admitted to the murders before they died? Why would both of them do that if it wasn't true? I could maybe see one of them, like, just being out of it and on their deathbed and confessing to some bullshit, but they both did. It's very strange. In 1993, James Blackburn, one of the prosecuting attorneys, admitted he had forged several court documents unrelated to the MacDonald case and had illegally wired money from his firm's bank, so he was convicted on fraud, embezzlement, forgery, and obstruction of justice. He got disbarred and only received 3 months in jail. I feel like he should have gotten more time for forging court documents. But this shows this was the type of guy who would have done illegal shit to win a case, I feel like. And even if there's no evidence now that he did anything in the MacDonald case, I think his involvement should be looked at suspiciously. Collette's parents both died in 1994, which, regardless of who did this, the pain and grief of what they went through is just awful, and I can't blame them in becoming suspicious of Jeffrey over the years and wanting the person they believed brutally murdered their daughter and grandchildren to see justice. So that's it for this case. Jeffrey is 79 years old. He is still in jail. He will probably never get out. I don't know what to believe with this case, and I'm sorry it's so long. There was just so much to go over, and I wanted you guys to get the full story and then decide for yourselves what you think.